The Funnies, number 4, cover dated January 1937, came out from Dell Comics. It featured Major Hoople disguised as Santa Claus on this Christmas-themed cover. There was a 4-page Captain Easy story from Roy Crane. Bud Fisher gave us a Mutt and Jeff story, as well as a Cicero's Cat story. Dan Dunn was featured in a 4-page story from writer-artist Norman Marsh. Scribbly returned from Sheldon Mayer in a 2-page story. Alley Oop was featured in a 4-page story from writer-artist V.T. Hamlin. Bob Moore writing Tad of the Tang Bank with art by Carl Pfeiffer. And the team also worked on Don Dixon and the Hidden Empire. G-Men on the Job was a 2-page story from writer Dick Blair and artist Milt Youngren. Youngren created G-Men on the Job with Dick Blair in the 30s, which appeared in a Big Little book and in a comic strip format in Dell's The Funnies. He provided art for several other Big Little books and illustrated advertising strips for Schwinn Bikes starring Speedy Wheeler in the 1940s. Regular Fellers was a short story from writer-artist Gene Burns. And Eugene Francis Burns, born March 18, 1889, lived until July 26, 1974. He created the long-running comic strip Regular Fellers, which he signed Gene Burns. His humorous look at suburban children was distributed by the Bell Syndicate and other syndicates from 1917 to 1949. Funny Picture Stories number 3, cover dated January 1937, was published by Comics Magazine. It featured lengthy 7-page comic strips, such as Dick Kent from Art Pinagian on art. Double Trouble was a 7-page story, written and drawn by Joe Baresh. Born 1916, lived until 2004. Since the mid-30s, he had been active as a syndicated artist. His highlights included Crosby's Country Cousins and the long-running daily Dynamite panel from 1953 to the 80s. In the 30s, Baresh had also done comic book art for Centaur Comics. He was a writer-artist for Detective Picture Stories, Western Picture Stories, Keen Detective Funnies, and the author of features like Buck Rush, The Caveman Cowboy, Double Trouble, Jimmy and Jean, Pete Kid Callahan, and Roadhouse Racket. Bob Colby was a 7-page story from writer-artist Martin Filchok. And Marty Filchok, born January 6, 1912, lived until September 5, 2012. An American cartoonist, Filchok illustrated more than 100 magazines including the Saturday Evening Post, Good Housekeeping, Reader's Digest, and the Journal of the American Medical Association. At the time of his death at age 100, he was described as the oldest working cartoonist. He had his first cartoon published in 1925 at the age of 13. King Comics number 10, cover dated January 1937, was published by David McKay Publications. It featured a Joe Musial cover with the characters Popeye, Little King, Wimpy, Henry, and Sweepy. EC Cigar gave us a 4-page Thimble Theater story featuring the characters Popeye, Wimpy, Sweepy, and Olive Oil. Don Moore wrote a 4-page story of Flash Gordon featuring art by Alex Raymond. Carl Anderson gave us a 1-page Henry strip, reprinted from the Henry Sundays at King Features Syndicate. Sport Features was a 1-page story about sports with art by Jack Burnley, reprinted from Sport Features Sundays. Rosie's Bow was a short story, written and drawn by George McManus, reprinted from Rosie's Bow Sundays, a King Features Syndicate strip, which ran across the top of Bringing Up Father's Sunday strips. And Bringing Up Father was also featured in this issue. Mandrake the Magician had a 4-page story written by Lee Falk with art by Phil Davis, reprinted from the Mandrake the Magician Sundays at King Features Syndicate. Mickey Mouse Magazine number 16 had a cover date of January 1937. It's volume 2, number 4, featuring the characters Mickey Mouse, Minnie Mouse, Donald Duck, Pluto, Three Little Pigs, and others. More Fun Comics number 17, cover dated January 1937, came out from DC Comics, then at the time known as National Allied. Volume 2, number 5, featuring a cover art by Vincent Sullivan of the character Spike Spaulding. The team of Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster worked on Dr. Occult, a 2-page story, which they wrote under the aliases of Leaguer and Ruths in their fantasy supernatural story. Siegel and Shuster also gave us a 2-page story, Calling All Cars, which they did sign with their own names in this detective mystery. Craig Flessel drew Pep Morgan in a 2-page story, also a 2-page Bradley Boy story, and a 2-page Thrilling True Stories, this one written by Richard Speed. Tom Hickey wrote and drew Wing Brady in a 2-page adventure story. Tom Hickey also gave us the 2-page science fiction short Mark Marson, as well as Brad Hardy in a 2-page story. Tom Hickey, born 1910, was active in comic book art since the mid-30s. For National DC, he worked on features like Wing Brady, The Golden Dragon, Brad Hardy, and Mark Marson. He then worked extensively for Dell publications in the 40s, doing Rex, King of the Deep, and Tom and Jerry. National allied, or DC Comics, and gave us a second title, cover dated January 1937. It was New Adventure Comics number 12. This was the first issue of this new title, the numbering of which continued from New Comics. Rated scarce by Gerber, it featured a Whitney Ellsworth cover. Some of the highlights include Captain Jim of the Texas Rangers, a 3-page story from writer-artist Homer Fleming in this Western. Homer Fleming, born October 10, 1882. Homer's comics career spanned from 1936 to 51, and he wrote and illustrated for DC Comics from 1936 through 45. Craig Flessel gave us another story, 2 pages of Steve Conrad. Siegel and Schuster returned using their own names in the detective mystery Federal Man, and this story very interesting, featuring a new character, Professor Grant, and Jor-El, a Federal Man of 3000 AD, not to be confused with Superman's father, who would later have the same name. Popular Comics number 12, cover dated January 1937, came from Dell Comics. It featured a Dick Tracy Christmas cover. Some of the highlights include a 4-page Dick Tracy story, The Detective Mystery, from writer-artist Chester Gould. Skippy was a short story from writer-artist Percy Crosby. Little Orphan Annie was featured in a 3-page text story from writer Harold Gray. Terry and the Pirates appeared in a 3-page text story from writer Milton Caniff. Apple, Mary, and Denis was a 4-page comic story from writer-artist Martha Orr. She was one of the few successful female cartoonists of her generation. Her uncle was Carrie Orr, cartoonist with the Chicago Tribune. She created the newspaper comic about the old but wise Apple Mary in 1934. Orr's strip dealt directly and realistically with the Great Depression. The character lost her trademark apple cart, and the strip gradually evolved into Mary Worth, after it was continued by Alan Saunders in 1938, when Martha Orr retired. Tip Top Comics number 9, cover dated January 1937, was published by United Features Syndicate. Tarzan is the cover feature, and his adventure inside the comic is drawn by Hal Foster. This issue also contains the first published work ever of Jack Davis, who at the age of 12 won an art contest, years later becoming important at EC Comics. This issue features a 6-page Tarzan story written and drawn by Hal Foster, and a 5-page Lil Abner story written and drawn by Al Cap.